everyone, and welcome to this SheClicks webinar about the basics of photography. It's our second webinar in the series, and today we're talking about Aperture. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to share my screen. So as I said, today we're talking about the basics of photography and specifically Aperture. I'm Angela Nicholson, and I'm the founder of SheClicks. So first, I'd just like to thank our webinar sponsor. Fujifilm is sponsoring the whole of this series of 5 webinars, and they've asked me to point out that they've got an interesting thing going on at the moment. You can actually hire a camera or a lens for free for 48 hours at the moment. So if you go to fujifilm-loan.com, you can select the time that you'd like to hire the kit and the date, and also obviously which kit. So if there's perhaps a lens or a camera you've been really interested in trying, you can hire it for free for 48 hours, and that includes postage. You can extend that loan if you like. That would be a paid loan, but if you decide to buy the kit, that is discounted from your purchase. So it's very worthwhile looking at. Perhaps if you've been thinking about getting an X-T4 or something, maybe now is the time to give it a go. So I just wanted to let you know about that option. So before we really get going, let's have a quick recap of what we spoke about in our first webinar, which was all about exposure and talking about exposure in general. So there are several connected elements when we're thinking about exposure, and it's really hard to explain or understand them in isolation. And really what you've got to do is just kind of jump in and try and understand one particular bit and then move on and then think about the next thing and then move on to the next thing. And eventually, and that's the process I'm going to take you through in these 5 webinars. So in the last webinar, we spoke about, as I said, exposure generally. This one is about aperture. Next one, we'll be talking about shutter speed, and then there'll be another one, and then we're going to talk about bringing it all together at the end. So hopefully at the end of it, it will all make sense. Now, the numbers are very strange, and especially so with apertures. So don't worry about it, and I will explain why they are a bit odd, and hopefully it will help you understand why that is. Yeah, it does take a while to understand it, so don't think it's not you. You're not particularly stupid or anything like that. It does take a little while to get your head around it, and certainly when somebody explained photography and exposure to me, I really didn't get it, and certainly not the first time, and probably not the second or third time. And it is really tempting to use that auto button or the auto mode. And particularly because actually probably, you know, a lot of the time you'll get a really quite decent image from it. But what you don't get is any control. You don't get your creative control over your images. So you're only ever going to produce what the camera thinks you want and not what you actually want to produce. So it really is worth persevering and taking control of aperture and shutter speed and exposure in general, so you can create the images that you want to make. And also don't miss the next webinars, because obviously you say these all come together, and the idea is that eventually you'll understand the whole thing. So what is exposure? Now, we touched on this, well, the whole of the last webinar was about this, but I'm just going to summarize it as it's the amount of light that's required to take an image. Now, we sometimes think of it as the brightness of an image. We look at it and say, oh, that's overexposed or that's underexposed. But actually in these webinars, we're really talking about the amount of light that you actually need to make an image on the sensor or the film in your camera. And this is controlled by the amount of time that the shutter is open, which is also known as the shutter speed or the exposure time, and the size of the aperture, and also the sensitivity of the film or the sensor. And sensitivity is also known as ISO. This webinar, as I said, is all about aperture, and we'll cover shutter speed in the next webinar and ISO in the one after that. So what is aperture? Well, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light passes to reach the sensor or film. The bigger the hole, the greater the amount of light can reach the sensor. Now, I tend to think of this as a hose pipe. If you have a big fat hose pipe and obviously lots of water pressure, then you'll be able to fill a bucket much quicker than if you have a little narrow hose pipe. So I think of it that way. And obviously, you know, light is moving at the speed of light, so it's zipping into the lens. And if you've got a big aperture, you'll get lots of light in. If you've got a small aperture, you'll only get a small amount of light in. The size of the aperture is adjusted by a series of blades, and I can show you that in this image. If you look there, don't worry about the sort of sparkly bits. That's just the effect of the lights that I was using. But you can see there's a series, and I think it's the sort of thing we see in the James Bond films, isn't it? You know, you can see those blades, and they're curving round and creating a hole in the middle. I think I counted them earlier. There's 9 blades. There's often 9 blades. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. Usually it's considered, you know, lots of blades is a really good thing, because the aim is often to try and create a really nice circular aperture. Now I've set quite a small aperture here, so you can see it's closed down, but as those blades kind of pull back, you would get a larger and larger aperture. So that's what it looks like, and you can see it if you peer into your lens and you set a smaller aperture and just press the shutter button halfway. You should see the aperture close down. How is aperture measured? Well, it's expressed as an F number or an F stop or F/ number, and the stops that comes from a time when we actually used to use like washers with different size holes, and they were dropped into the camera or the lens to change the aperture size. But why is it an F number? Well, the F stands for focal length, and it's because actually the aperture setting is a ratio of the focal length of the lens to the diameter of the aperture in millimeters. Now, as you know, we talk about focal length in millimeters, and we talk about apertures in F numbers. We don't tend to talk about them in millimeters, but that's just to sort of simplify the math. So we have F, which stands for focal length, divided by the aperture diameter. Now, there's not an exam on this, and you don't really need to remember this this equation, but it just helps it kind of embed in your head and understand why the numbers are so strange. So if you have a 100mm lens with an aperture that is 25 millimeters in diameter, the aperture will be f/24, and it's, you know, it's just a little bit of maths. You've got the focal length divided by 25, it's f/4, so it's a ratio. It's a fraction, I like to think of it as. If you have a 200mm lens with a 25mm aperture, you get f/8. So we know from maths at school that 1 divided by 4 is a quarter, 1 divided by 8 is about half the size. You know, it's a smaller size aperture. So f/8 is smaller than f/4 because I think of it as a fraction. If we have a 200mm lens with a 50mm aperture, we get f/4. So now you start to understand why, if you have a small lens, say like a 35mm lens might have a 1.8 aperture. I've got one just here. Actually, this goes to f2. So it's quite a small lens. But if you had an 85mm lens with a f2 aperture, it will be a lot bigger. And that's because the actual dimensions of the aperture have to be bigger to get that aperture in there. So I hope that helps to make sense a little bit. So let's now look at the aperture settings. Now, on the left-hand side, you've got a large aperture, and on the right-hand side, we've got a small aperture. Now, the first thing to point out there is that my graphic skills have kind of let me down a little bit, because the external dimension of the aperture doesn't change. What does change is the size of the hole, but the only way I could make the hole smaller was to make the whole aperture smaller. But I'm not a graphic designer, so please forgive me. But if you look on the left-hand side, we have f1. Now, that is obviously a very large aperture. There aren't very many lenses at all with that that size of aperture. In fact, Fuji does make one. It's a 50mm, and it's a really lovely lens. But you can actually get lenses which are even have even bigger apertures than that. But so an f1 lens basically means that the aperture diameter is actually the same as the focal length. As you close down, we mean that the aperture is getting smaller. We start to see these other numbers appearing, like f1.4, f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, etc. Going down to, you might get down to f22. Some people might even see smaller than that, f32. And those are what we call hole stops, or hole exposure values. And you might remember from the first webinar that when you adjust in hole stops, you either halve or double the amount of light that's reaching the sensor. So say, for example, you have f5.6 set and you close the aperture down to f8, you are halving the amount of light that is going to hit the sensor. Equally, if you open the aperture up to f4, you are doubling the amount of light. So even more light, double the amount of light is actually getting through to the sensor. Now you'll notice that on this, this exposure gradient, we have got between the hole stops, we've got two little markings. Now these are the sort of 1/3 stop apertures, and basically you can usually adjust the aperture in 1/3 stops because it gives you more control over exposure. And that you might see figures like, you know, f6.3 or I think f9.1. We don't tend to remember them in the same way, but they are available because they help you finesse your exposure and make sure you get exactly what you want. But when we talk about exposure and aperture, we tend to just talk in hole stops because it's easier to visualize. But obviously, you know, when you're setting your camera up, you set whichever aperture is appropriate for your image and your scene. So let's have a look at lens aperture markings or lens markings. Now lenses are marked to show the aperture setting of, to show the maximum aperture setting that's available. And we get worked up about that because obviously you can imagine you can have there's a maximum size of aperture that you can have in a lens because it can't go any bigger than the barrel and the mechanics. But you can always keep closing it down, although we do set limits because it's just not feasible to keep having, you know, smaller and smaller apertures. So we mark the lens so we know what the maximum aperture is. And sometimes 1 colon is used instead of S/ because remember I said it was it's a ratio, and that's just a mathematical way of doing a ratio. So with a Fujinon XR35mm 1.2R WR lens, the maximum aperture is f2. So we're talking about a 35mm lens with an f2 maximum aperture. And that's actually that lens there I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. Now we've got a zoom lens, and this is a 16 to 80mm lens, and it's got an f4 aperture. So you can see that because it goes 1:4, which means the maximum aperture is f4. Now we talk about this as being a zoom with a constant aperture. And what that means is, let's just have a look at the next lens. Now this is a zoom lens, the 18 to 55mm, which is a really popular lens for a kit lens, good everyday lens. But if you can look at the apertures, it says 1 to 2.8 to 4, and what that means is that the maximum aperture is 2.8 at the widest point of the lens, which is 18mm, and it's f4 at the longest point, which is 55mm. Now we call this a variable aperture lens. Whereas I said before, the 16 to 80 is a constant aperture lens, and it just refers to the fact that the aperture will change if you zoom. Generally speaking, lenses with a constant maximum aperture are more expensive and more sort of highly prized than one with a variable aperture, because obviously you don't have to change the exposure when you're zooming in and out. But obviously those with a constant aperture tend to be a little bit bigger, and also they are more expensive. Now let's think about taking control of the aperture setting. You may remember from our last webinar that aperture priority mode is the mode in which you set the aperture and the camera takes control of the shutter speed, and it's a really handy way of working. I use it a lot, and I know a lot of pro photographers and enthusiasts use it a lot. But you can also use manual exposure mode. In this mode, you set both the aperture and the shutter speed settings. And this is a fantastically useful way of working. It gives you the maximum amount of control, but it's also a bit slower because you've obviously got to keep an eye on the exposure settings and make sure you're getting the right balance. So a lot of people see manual as being the sort of ultimate control, and it is the ultimate control, but don't feel compelled to always use it or to strive to use it, because lots of people use aperture priority and shutter priority because it's quicker and more convenient. It's just what's appropriate for the scene, what you're photographing, and how you feel. Now, on most cameras, the aperture setting is adjusted using a command dial. And you'll be able to see that. You can look it up in your manual if you're not sure. Usually there is a mode dial, and you'll set the mode dial. So you're in aperture priority mode or you're in manual mode, and there'll be another dial that you use to adjust the exposure settings. However, some cameras or some lenses, sorry, have an aperture ring. And it's probably easier if I show you at the end when we go back to full screen. But you can use this to adjust the aperture. And I find that a really interesting way of working. I really like it. It's a traditional way of controlling the aperture, but it means you can control the aperture. You can adjust the setting even without turning the camera on, which is really handy. Now, the Fujifilm XS10, for example, it actually has the controls that are more commonly seen, where you adjust with 2 dials, but it's still actually compatible with Fuji's lenses, which have a lens ring. So you can choose to use whichever one you want. Now, this is the back of the Fujifilm XS10, and it's showing you that the exposure, well, firstly, the exposure mode has been set to manual, and we know that because there's an M at the bottom. And then where it says SS, that's the shutter speed, and it says 125, that's 125th. And then just to the right of that, we've got F8. Now, if you look, you can see actually there's that little semicircle is showing you which dial to use to adjust the aperture. So it's set to F8, but I could use the front dial just to roll it one way or the other to either increase or decrease the size of the aperture. So why do we adjust the aperture? Well, firstly, we use it to control exposure, and we kind of touched on that, and it links in with shutter speed, which we'll be talking about in the next webinar. But another key reason why we might choose to work with aperture and aperture priority mode is because we want to take control of depth of field. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is the zone of acceptable focus or sharpness that extends in front of and behind the point of focus. Now, if you imagine focusing on a point, it doesn't just sort of magically, it's not magically sharp in front of an area that's completely blurred, and equally there's a little area in front which looks sharp. Now, depth of field is the size of that area that's sharp either side of where you are focused. Through using aperture, we can make that area either bigger or smaller. So this graphic just sort of explains this in a fairly basic way. So again, we've got the apertures getting big all over rather than just in the middle. But so we know that f2.8 is a large aperture. So you imagine we've got the camera and we focus just at the front of this tree or bush. And the depth of field is quite narrow. It's only extending far enough just to focus on, I've said it's a tree, it could be a bush. So we've just got quite a narrow area of focus or depth of field. If we close down to F8 and focus on the same point, we will get more extensive depth of field. So it will extend further back from the focus point, but also a little bit further forward. Closing down again to F22, and we get even more depth of field. Now, one thing to notice here is that, as I said, the depth of field extends forward of the focus and behind the focus point as well. Generally speaking, you get twice as much depth of field behind the point of focus as you do in front. And that's quite a useful tool when you're thinking about, well, where do I focus in this scene? You kind of think, well, where's the depth of field going to extend to? It's going to go twice as far as it will in front. So, sometimes you might think, actually, I'm going to focus a little bit further back or a little bit further forward, depending on what you focus on. That kind of breaks down with macro because it's all so narrow, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference. So I'm not going to go into depth of field in great depth, but it's just worth touching on because obviously it's really important for aperture selection. So now looking at a series of images shot at different apertures. Now my convenient model, Otto here, you can see, if you look at his nose, you'll see that there is some detail on his, on the buttony bit of his nose. You can actually see a little bit of detail, but it's not completely sharp. I've focused on his eyes, and the sharp zone is kind of extending up his nose and onto his forehead, and the top of his head is almost sharp. It's just getting a bit soft, and you can see quite a bit of detail in his ears. If you look in the background, you can see over to the left there, there's a dark band. And basically what this is, it's a wardrobe, it's a wooden wardrobe. And the dark band is basically the shadow of where the edge of the wardrobe is. And then there's a series of about 3 or 4 dark dots. They're knots in the wood. So you can see those at f5.6. They're soft, but they're visible. Now we're shooting at f4, and straight away you can notice that the those bits of those knots in the wood that I was talking about, they've instantly started to look a bit softer, and also that dark edge of the wardrobe has started to sort of look more like a gradient than an edge. Looking at Otto's face, you can see there's still quite, his forehead is still quite sharp, and there's some detail in the fur on his ears, but his buttony nose, there's a little less detail in it now. It's a little bit softer, and it extends, the sharpness doesn't really kick in until you're a little bit further up his nose. F2. Now, looking at the wardrobe first, those knots that are in the wood, they've just about disappeared. You can barely see them. There's kind of like a vague impression of a little bit of darkness, but they've almost completely gone. Similarly, I don't think you'd really know that that's an edge to the wardrobe. Looking at Otto's nose, you can see now that the dark bit of his nose really has no detail. It's completely soft. And the focus, if you go up his nose over his forehead, actually the sharp bit doesn't go nearly so far back on his forehead, and his ears are actually quite soft too. This is f1.4. It's quite a popular aperture for people who, there's a lot of 85mm 1.4 lenses, which portrait photographers absolutely love, because you can really restrict the depth of field. And you can see here how limited it is, because there's actually only a very narrow band of sort of Otto's eyes and a little bit of his forehead that is sharp. If you notice his front paw that's sticking out, that's just a sort of a blob of a blur now. So this is a f1, and I shot it on Fujifilm's 50mm f1 lens. You might notice that I was focusing on Otto's eyes, and I think I've actually just missed the focus slightly here. It's a little bit further up his head than I would like. And this makes a good point about when you're shooting with small apertures, you need to be quite careful. Sorry, large apertures, small numbers. When you're shooting with large apertures, you need to be very careful with your focusing, because you've got such shallow depth of field that if you miss the focus, then the sharp zone is going to be in the wrong place. Now, just a little bit more about depth of field. As I say, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, because it all gets quite complicated, and I think we're already dealing with something more significant that we need to get our heads around first. If you keep the aperture the same, there is less depth of field at long focal length. So I'm thinking about telephoto lenses, you will get less depth of field. So conversely, if you use a wide angle lens, you will get more depth of field. You get less depth of field as the subject gets closer. And the most extreme cases of this, so I've just already mentioned, is macro photography. When you get really, really close, you get very, very shallow depth of field. So not much of the area is sharp at all. And obviously the converse is also true. You get more depth of field as the subject gets further away. So when you're shooting macro photography, often people use really quite small apertures to try and get more of the subject in focus. And we don't have to be talking about extreme macro, it could just be quite close up, but you might need to use a smaller aperture to get more depth of field. Narrow apertures are also really popular for landscape photography, because obviously there you tend to want more of the scene sharp. Not always, there are creative reasons for having shallow depth of field, but often the typical landscape scene people photograph with a small aperture to get lots of depth of field. Already mentioned that with portraits that we tend to shoot with wide apertures because we often want to blur the background, but actually you might want to use, say if you're photographing 2 or 3 people or more, you might want to close down the aperture a little bit so that you can be sure that everybody's in focus. Now, diffraction, just as you start to understand what depth of field is and how to control it, diffraction rears its ugly head. Diffraction is it's a sort of feature of physics, and basically light bends a little as it goes over the aperture. Now, again, thinking about the hose pipe and water sort of example I was talking about before, if you imagine if you've got that beam of that sort of squirt of water, that jet of water, and it goes across the top of the bucket, if you just catch the lip of the bucket, it's going to splay out and splash around. And that's effectively what happens to the light. It kind of, some of it bends. And as you close down the aperture and make it smaller, obviously more of the light that is going into the lens is actually affected by the surface edge of the aperture. And that means more of that light is bending. The problem is that that bent light is harder to focus. And as a result, the subject or your image is actually a little bit softer at smaller apertures than it is at larger apertures. And this, in effect, is the impact of diffraction. So to get the best balance between depth of field and diffraction, it's usually a good idea to shoot at slightly less of a, not use the smallest aperture that's available on your lens. So for example, if your lens will close down to f32, then it's probably not the best choice because the image is likely to look a little bit softer than you might imagine. You will get lots of depth of field, it's just none of it is really, really sharp. So you might want to shoot at f22 or f16. And there was a time when people always were closing down. There was the f64 group and things like that. But actually these days, I think a lot of people are sort of opening up to the idea of shooting at slightly wider apertures, f16 or something like that when it's a landscape. And we've also got option to do things like focus stacking, if you really want. But just before we get, let's not get bogged down in that. The point is that if you want to have good depth of field and good sharpness, don't close right the way down to the minimum aperture. So some homework. Now, as I said before in the previous webinar, please don't send it in. I'm not going to mark it. It's really just to try and help you sort of embed some of the things that we've been speaking about during this webinar. So the first thing to do is set your camera to aperture priority mode. And you remember that will enable you to set the aperture while the camera controls the shutter speed. Now, focus on an object in a scene with depth. Now, but what I mean by depth is something that has something in the foreground, something in the middle, and something in the background. And it could be a landscape, but it could be something like you might arrange some chess pieces on a board, or you might have some railings or a fence or something like that. Focus on a point in that image. Maybe ideally make it the center point in the image. So compose, so you've got something in the center. Maybe you've got the scene sort of going at 45 degrees, the railings going at 45 degrees through your picture. Shoot that at every aperture setting, and you may need to put your camera on a tripod because the shutter speed may go quite low. So if you put it on a tripod, you'll be the camera will be nice and steady, and you'll be able to get exactly reproducible images, but you're only changing the aperture in each shot. So shoot an image at every full aperture setting. Now zoom in or use a longer lens and repeat the exercise. So basically focus at the same point for every shot, but just close the aperture down from the maximum to the minimum. Repeat the exercise, but move closer to the subject. And you can do that with either lens or either zoom point. Now, open the images on your computer and see how the depth of field changes. And this is why we wanted a scene that's got objects at different depths, because you're going to be looking to see whether, where's your focus point, where that it's in the middle, how far back does the sharpness go at each aperture setting, how far forward does the sharpness go at each aperture setting, just so you get kind of sense of how much you need to adjust to change the depth of field. Also, with one set of images, zoom right in to 100% on your computer screen and see if you can see the impact of diffraction. You should see, as you move from a wide aperture to a small aperture, when it's wide open, you might notice as you close down, the image gets a little bit sharper, and then as you close down further, it will continue to get sharp, and then after a little while it starts to get softer again. And usually like the last two aperture settings, you'll notice that the image isn't quite as sharp as you thought it would be. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. Nadia says, how do I find out if the so-called sweet spot of my aperture on a lens, how do I find out the so-called sweet spot aperture for a lens? I often hear that you should use a very small aperture sharpness in landscape. Yes, so this is exactly the point I was talking about, Nadia. So the sweet spot is basically with a lens and the aperture is the point at which it produces the sharpest image at the point of focus. So the easiest way to do that actually is to do something like focus on a blank wall, not a blank wall, sorry, a brick wall, something that's got a bit of texture and detail in it, so you can actually see what you're looking at. Or you could do something like pin a newspaper onto a wall, anything really, or photograph a painting. Focus, put your camera on a tripod, focus at the center, and then take a shot at every aperture setting. Then if you open up those images on your computer and look at them at 100% and look at the focus point, the center area, when you find that is looking its absolute sharpest, that is the sweet spot. And often, actually, that's a surprisingly small aperture. It might be f5.6. Depends on what your lens's maximum aperture is, but it might be 5.6 or f8. And then beyond that, you will get more depth of field, and you might see less vignetting or something like that. But ultimately, when you get to kind of 22 and 32, you will start to see the point where you were focusing is actually getting a little bit softer. So I hope that helped. Pauline says, can I do the homework on a macro lens? Yes, you can. Of course you can, yes. What you will find is that if you're going in really, really close, and sort of getting life-size reproduction, that you won't really see that the depth of field extends further behind the subject quite so much. So you might be better, you can use a macro lens, but maybe not go for the ultimate in life-size reproduction, maybe come back a little bit. And also, actually, you can use a macro lens to photograph just about any subject. Macro lenses can make great portrait lenses, for example. So Sue says, how did you manage to keep the dog so still to take all those images? Basically, he was very bored. He just was a bit snoozy and looking at the trick. The difficulty was actually getting him to open his eyes in all of the shots, which is probably why I moved a bit, because he kept closing his eyes. And I wanted him to have them open so they were in the shot. Sarah's asked me, would you recommend aperture priority for shooting children, or manual or shutter priority? It kind of depends, Sarah, whether they're running around or sitting still. I think I might go for manual for that, to be honest. I mean, if they were, I might go for manual, because obviously that lets you set a shutter speed which will freeze them, and also give you the depth of field that you want. But equally, it depends. If you're photographing one child, that's one thing, because as soon as you focus on them, they're sharp, and you've got the depth of field that you want. But if there's two children together moving about, then it might be, it's a slightly different thing. So if you just want the second child kind of in the background having fun while the other kid's in the foreground, then that's a lot easier, put it that way. If you've got two kids that you both want sharp and they're running around, it's tricky. But if you sit them on a log or something like that, and you've got it a little bit more controllable. So I hope that helped. Pauline has asked, how do you know which aperture to start with? Well, this is why you need to sort of do a little bit of experimentation and think about what depth of field you want. And it really, I'm going to cover this in our last webinar, where we go over, where I talk about pulling it all together. But when you look at a scene, you're basically trying to decide what are the most important elements to you. Is it the movement and do you want to freeze it, or do you want to blur it? And how do you want the depth of field to appear? Do you want it to be deep, or do you want it to be shallow? So I think when I first got into photography, I kind of felt that everything should be sharp. I felt that it should all be front to back sharpness. So I wandered around shooting, this is before I heard of diffraction, shooting at everything at the smallest aperture possible. And then gradually I kind of discovered that actually it's quite interesting to have a bit of background blur or selective focus and stuff like that. So I would just say, you know, experiment and see what you like. If you're really not sure, then often F8 is a good starting point. And sometimes, say with street photography, something like that, I might set my camera up to f8 and say, I might do that in manual mode, set it to f8 and set an aperture of 125, sorry, a shutter speed of 125. And then I know I'm going to freeze most things. And also I kind of know the depth, I've got a reasonable depth of field. So when I focus on something, you know, the depth of field isn't so shallow that I won't get much in focus. And so you've got a little bit to play with. So if you're really not sure, then go for f8. It's a good solid kind of full-back aperture. Catherine has asked me, do you have auto ISO? Yes. A lot of cameras now let you set auto ISO, which is really, really useful. And often, if I shoot in manual exposure mode, I often use auto ISO because I know that actually I'm setting the shutter speed and I'm setting the aperture. So I'm getting the control that I want, but the camera is kind of adjusting the exposure up and down as I need, because, you know, adjusting the sensitivity or ISO. So it is really useful. But I'm going to talk about ISO the webinar after next. Okay, Marsha says, I'm not sure I understand the relationship of the numbers on the variable aperture lens. Can you explain what f3.5 to 6.3 means in relation to the aperture you shoot with? Yes, that is a really, really good question, actually. Those values, 3.5 to 6.3, what that means is that at the shortest point of your lens, the maximum aperture you can set is 3.5. And at the longest point of the lens, the maximum aperture you can set is 6.3. So that's a little bit smaller than 5.6, if you remember. So you've got 3.5 to 6.3. So if you're at the widest point of your lens, you can set 3.5, or you can set a smaller aperture. And you can set it, often you can find in the specs what the smallest aperture is, and often, or you can just keep adjusting until you can't adjust it anymore. And you have a full range of aperture options, but you can't make it any wider. And similarly at 6.3, sorry, the telephoto end of your lens, the widest aperture you can set is 6.3. Now at 6.3, you won't get a great deal of blurring. So that is the kind of like downside of what we call a relatively slow lens. We talk about lenses with fast lenses when they have a wide maximum aperture. So something like 2.8 is pretty good, but you get, you know, there's 1.8 and 1.4, they're very fast lenses. That looks like the last of the questions. I hope everybody's found that useful. I suggest, as with the previous webinar, that it will be on YouTube very soon, and most of it does appear to be on Facebook. So watch it again, understand it. But if you have any questions, please drop me a line, Angela@SheClicks.net. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.